The tank stood on a railway flat car at Kubinka Proving Ground, 40 miles west of Moscow, its Rolls-Royce Meteor engine cold, and its glasses pitted where a shaped charge had struck it near the Imjin River in April 1951. Soviet armor officers walked around it in the January frost of 1952, running gloved fingers along the cast turret and the 20-pounder gun barrel. The serial numbers had been filed, but the plates on the transmission housing were still legible. Royal Ordnance Factory, Barnbow, Leeds. Their prize was a Centurion Mark III, abandoned by the 8th King's Royal Irish Hussars during the Chinese Spring Offensive, and shipped east through Manchuria at Mao Zedong's personal instruction. In Whitehall, the loss was known but not publicized. A JIC assessment circulated in February 1952 to the Chiefs of Staff noted that at least one Centurion in serviceable condition had fallen into hostile hands and that the Soviets would almost certainly conduct comparative trials against the T-54. The paper, drafted under Sir William Hayter's watch at the Foreign Office Northern Department, recommended no public acknowledgement. The Attlee government had left office in October 1951. Churchill's second administration inherited the problem and did nothing to alter the silence. The Centurion was Britain's finest post-war engineering achievement, designed at the Department of Tank Design at Chobham in 1943, rushed into production too late for the Rhine crossing, and now, 7 years on, the reason the British Army of the Rhine could plausibly hold the North German Plain against a Category 1 Soviet army. The Kubinka trials began that spring. Colonel A. Kravtsev, chief of the Armoured Research Section, ordered the vehicle stripped and reassembled by his fitters, who were startled to find that every component had been machined to tolerances tighter than anything on the T-54 production line at Nizhny Tagil. The gun control gear, built by Metropolitan Vickers, held the barrel steady on the move to within a milliradian. The Horseman suspension, dismissed by Soviet designers in 1946 as an obsolete British eccentricity, absorbed cross-country punishment that shook the T-54's torsion bars to failure. When Kravtsev's gunners fired the 20-pounder at captured German armor plate, the tungsten cord shot punched clean through 120 millimeters at 1,000 meters. Their own 100mm D-10T could not match it. The verdict, delivered in a classified report to Marshal Zhukov's deputy at the Main Armoured Directorate in July 1952, was uncomfortable. The Centurion was, in every category except gun caliber, superior to anything the Soviet Union could put on the Elbe. Fire control, crew ergonomics, reliability over 300 miles, the ability to engage accurately at speed, the British machine won each trial. One passage, later cited by the historian Stephen Zaloga from documents released after 1991, recorded that Soviet crews found the driver's periscopes and the commander's cupola so superior that copying them was recommended immediately. The T-55, which entered production in 1958, would carry a cupola strikingly similar to the Centurion's. None of this was known in London. The Foreign Office assumed the vehicle had been cannibalized or scrapped. The Ministry of Supply pressed on with the Centurion, Mark V, Mark VII, Mark X, each variant thickening armor and refining the gun until, by 1959, the L7 105mm rifled cannon made the tank the deadliest gun platform in NATO. What the JIC did not yet understand was that Kubinka's verdict had already reshaped Soviet armored doctrine, and that the next generation of Warsaw Pact tanks, the T-62, the T-64, was being designed around a single question the Russians had learned to ask: how do we kill a Centurion? At the Royal Armoured Corps Centre at Bovington in the summer of 1952, Major General Sir Harold Pyman was reading loss reports from Korea and reaching a different conclusion. The Centurion had performed extraordinarily against Chinese infantry assaults on Hill 355 and at the Imjin, where the 8th Hussars Squadron under Major Henry Huth had fired 504 rounds in a single engagement and driven off 5 successive waves. But the vehicle had been designed for European conditions against a mechanized enemy, and Pyman, who would take command of Northern Army Group in 1957, believed that the real test was still coming. His memorandum to the Director of Royal Armoured Corps, dated August 14, 1952, argued for accelerated production and a heavier main armament. The 20-pounder was excellent. Against a hypothetical Soviet tank, with 200 millimeters of frontal armour, it would not be enough. The British Army of the Rhine, 40,000 men and 4 armoured regiments strong, was the tripwire on which NATO's Central Front depended. The Chiefs of Staff Global Strategy paper of June 1952, drafted under Field Marshal Sir William Slim, made the equation explicit. Britain could not match Soviet mass, so British armour had to be qualitatively superior, and British nuclear weapons had to guarantee escalation. The Centurion was one leg of that stool. The V-bomber force, then in prototype at Woodford and Weybridge, was the other. Between them, Slim wrote, they would purchase a margin of time. Time for the Americans to arrive, time for the mobilization of reserves, time for diplomacy to work. The Centurion's real proving ground came not in Germany but in the Sinai, in October 1956. Britain sold the tank to Israel from 1959 onward, but the Egyptian army, equipped with T-34/85s and Sherman variants, had already been fought by British Centurions of the 6th Royal Tank Regiment during Operation Musketeer. At Port Said on November 6th, Sea Squadron under Major Peter Willis engaged Egyptian Su-100 assault guns dug in around the harbour. 3 Centurions were hit. None were destroyed. Willis's own tank took a 100mm round on the mantlet at 400 metres and continued to fight for another 6 hours. The after-action report filed at the War Office in December 1956 and now held at Q under W0288 recorded that the vehicle's ability to absorb punishment exceeded the most optimistic pre-war estimates. Suez destroyed Anthony Eden and exposed the limits of British power. It did not destroy faith in the Centurion. If anything, the Egyptian campaign confirmed what Bovington had believed. The tank could take a beating no Soviet design could match. When Harold Macmillan replaced Eden in January 1957, the Defence Review under Duncan Sandys cut manpower savagely. The 1957 White Paper reduced the army from 690,000 to 375,000 by 1962. But Sandys, for all his enthusiasm for nuclear missiles, did not cut the Centurion. He accelerated the Mark 10 with the L7 gun, and authorized export sales that would eventually place the tank in the hands of 11 armies from Sweden to South Africa to Australia. The L7 was the point at which British engineering achieved something remarkable. Developed at the Royal Armament Research and Development Establishment at Fort Halstead by a team under L.R. Carr, the 105mm rifled gun could penetrate 250mm of armour at 1,000 meters using the new APDS ammunition. The Americans, whose M60 was underperforming against Soviet targets in classified trials at Aberdeen, took the unprecedented step of licensing the L7 for their own tank. By 1962, every M60 rolling out of the Detroit arsenal carried a British gun. Fort Halstead had done what Kubinka's verdict had implied was necessary. It had raised the ceiling again. The Rhine Army lived in the late 1950s and 1960s under a specific and rehearsed nightmare. It was called General Defense Plan, and its assumptions were bleak. Soviet forces in East Germany, 20 divisions, 3,000 tanks, would attack across the inner German border with 48 hours warning at most. The British First Corps, holding a sector from Hanover south to the Harz Mountains, would fight a delaying battle from prepared positions on the Weser and Leine rivers. The plan assumed the Centurion, and later the Chieftain, would achieve kill ratios of 5-to-1 against Soviet armour. Anything less and the front would collapse before the American reinforcement fleet reached Bremerhaven. Chieftain, the Centurion's successor, was the tank on which everything now depended. Designed at Leyland Motors from 1958 and entering service in 1966, it carried a 120mm rifled gun, the largest caliber of any Western tank, an armour so thick that British designers had, for the first time, accepted a top speed of only 25 miles per hour as the price of survival. The philosophy was pure Bovington: outrange, outshoot, outlast. The Royal Ordnance Factory at Nottingham produced the L11A5 gun in a purpose-built facility, and the ammunition, particularly the L15APDS and later the L23APFSDS, was developed at Fort Halstead under the direction of Dr. John Barnes. Chieftain had teething problems. The Leyland L60 multi-fuel engine, chosen because NATO planning assumed diesel shortages during a European war, was chronically unreliable. In 1971, availability rates in BAOR fell below 40%. The Defence Secretary Lord Carrington received a briefing at MOD Main Building in March that year, describing the situation as operationally serious. Yet even a chieftain that could only move short distances was a formidable defensive weapon. Dug in on the reverse slopes of the lower Saxony hills, its 120mm gun could engage T-62s at 2,000 metres and destroy them with the first round. The tactical doctrine refined at the Royal Military College of Science at Shrivenham treated the tank less as a mobile weapon than as a mobile pillbox, one that could be picked up and moved when the tactical situation demanded. British Army trials against captured Soviet vehicles, conducted in secrecy at the Fighting Vehicles Research and Development Establishment at Chertsey, confirmed the calculation. A T-62, obtained through Israeli channels after the 1967 war, was subjected to comparative fire trials in 1969. The results, classified top secret Umbra and now partially released at Kew under DEFE 24, showed that Chieftain's L11 could penetrate the T-62's frontal glacis at every combat range. The reverse was not true. Soviet 115mm smoothbore ammunition, tested against Chieftain armour plates at Kirkcudbright Range in Scotland, failed to penetrate at ranges beyond 1,500 metres. What made these figures politically important was that Whitehall could not admit to having them. The T-62 had been supplied by Israel on the understanding that the intelligence would remain compartmented. The Joint Intelligence Committee, chaired in 1969 by Sir Dennis Greenhill, restricted circulation of the Chertsey report to 15 names. Even the Cabinet Defence and Overseas Policy Committee received only a sanitised summary. The Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, was told orally by his Defence Secretary Denis Healey that British armour retained a decisive qualitative edge over anything the Warsaw Pact could field. Healey did not elaborate. He did not need to. The Chertsey figures underwrote every deployment decision the Wilson government made about BAOR, and they underwrote the argument, made repeatedly to the Treasury, that cutting the Rhine Army further would collapse the tripwire on which the American guarantee ultimately rested. At GCHQ Cheltenham, in a set of huts inherited from the wartime government code and cipher school, a section known as J Division was reading Soviet military traffic that touched occasionally on the armoured question. The intercepts were fragmentary. High-grade Soviet military ciphers had defeated British cryptanalysis since 1948, when the switch to one-time pads following the Venona Compromise closed the door on strategic communications. What remained was radio-telephone traffic from Soviet units in East Germany, exercise reports, logistics chatter, and the occasional lapse in tradecraft during training exercises at Magdeburg and Cottbus. In 1961, during Exercise Berger, a Soviet armoured division commander broadcast in clear voice a complaint about the mechanical reliability of his T-54 fleet. The intercept, forwarded from the British listening station at Teufelsberg in West Berlin to Cheltenham and then to the JIC, contained a specific figure. 22% of his tanks were non-operational after 200 kilometres of road march. The figure was not decisive on its own, but combined with photographic intelligence from RAF Canberra flights over the inner German border zones, reconnaissance conducted under the code name Robin, It suggested that Soviet armoured mobility was substantially less than NATO planning assumed. The JIC assessment, JIC 6147, argued cautiously that the Warsaw Pact's ability to sustain a rapid armoured thrust across the North German plain might be materially less than previously estimated. The Chief of the Defence Staff, Lord Mountbatten, read the paper with characteristic scepticism. He had spent the war watching intelligence assessments proved right and wrong in equal measure, and he was suspicious of any conclusion that made the Soviet threat easier. His marginal note, preserved in the Mountbatten papers at Southampton University, read, "Warsaw Pact reliability is our best hope, but our worst assumption." The observation shaped the way British defence planning treated Soviet armour for the next decade. Whitehall would plan for the maximum threat and hope for the actual one. MI6 ran a parallel operation, less about tanks than about the men who designed them. From the late 1950s, a network of émigré contacts, run out of the London station under an officer whose identity remains classified, cultivated Soviet armoured engineers who travelled to trade fairs in Vienna, Belgrade and Leipzig. The most productive of these contacts, codenamed Cheval, was a metallurgist attached to the Nizhny Tagil Design Bureau. Between 1959 and 1963, Cheval provided drawings and specifications for the new T-62 gun, the U-5TS 115mm smoothbore, along with an assessment of its likely armour-piercing performance. When the T-62 entered service in 1961, MI6 already knew what it could do. Cheval was compromised in 1963, in circumstances that have never been officially explained. The most likely explanation, given the pattern of Soviet counterintelligence successes in that period, is that George Blake, who had been arrested in April 1961 and had by then betrayed hundreds of British operations to the KGB, had disclosed enough about MI6 tradecraft to allow the identification of technical contacts. Whatever the mechanism, Cheval disappeared. The intelligence he had provided, however, remained useful. It informed the chieftain's design specifications, particularly the decision to move directly to 120mm, rather than match the Soviet 115mm. The pattern was one that would repeat throughout the Cold War. British intelligence rarely obtained decisive strategic secrets from Soviet armoured programs, but it obtained enough, through signals, imagery and human sources, to shape design decisions that gave BAOR a running advantage. The Kubinka verdict had established that the Soviets studied captured British equipment obsessively. What the Russians did not know, and what MI6 worked hard to conceal, was that the British were studying them back, one metallurgist and one intercept at a time. The nuclear question sat above the armoured one like a shadow. If the Rhine Army fought and lost, Britain would use tactical nuclear weapons. If tactical use failed, the V-bomber force would strike Soviet cities. This escalation ladder, formalized in the 1957 Defense White Paper and refined through the 1960s, was the doctrine on which every conventional deployment ultimately rested. The Centurion and the Chieftain were designed to buy time. The Vulcan and the Polaris submarine were designed to make the buying worthwhile. The V-bomber force reached its operational peak in 1962. Bomber Command's strike force comprised three types: the Valiant, the Victor and the Vulcan, dispersed across 10 main operating bases and 36 dispersal airfields under the Quick Reaction Alert System. 4 aircraft, 2 per squadron, sat at 15-minute readiness, armed with Yellow Sun, Mark II megaton weapons or the newer Redbeard tactical bomb. During the Cuban crisis in October 1962, the alert state was raised to alert condition 3 on October 27th. The Chief of the Air Staff, Sir Thomas Pike, was informed at 3:10 that morning that American forces had gone to DEFCON 2. British V-bombers were dispersed within hours. What made the British posture distinctive was that Bomber Command retained targeting independence. The Nassau Agreement of December 1962, negotiated by Harold Macmillan with John F. Kennedy after the collapse of the Skybolt missile program, secured Polaris for the Royal Navy on condition of NATO assignment, but with a national escape clause. British forces could be used independently where Her Majesty's government may decide that supreme national interests are at stake. The phrase had been drafted by the Cabinet Secretary Sir Norman Brooke and refined by the Foreign Office. It preserved in a single subordinate clause the fiction and the reality of British nuclear sovereignty. The Chief of the Air Staff briefed successive Prime Ministers on the target list in personal oral form. The details were held in a single copy at High Wycombe, the headquarters of Bomber Command, and reviewed annually. The list, according to Peter Hennessy's work in the papers of the Joint Intelligence Committee, comprised industrial and command centers west of the Urals, with particular emphasis on the Soviet oil complex at Baku and the command bunkers around Moscow. The doctrine assumed that a British strike, delivered independently, could inflict damage sufficient to cause unacceptable Soviet losses, the term of art used in JYC papers of the period. The armoured and nuclear postures were connected in ways that were rarely made explicit. The Centurion and Chieftain provided the conventional threshold below which nuclear escalation would not be triggered. If British armour could hold for 72 hours, the political calculation shifted. London could plausibly claim that the war remained conventional and that nuclear use was avoidable. If British armour collapsed in 24 hours, the pressure for early tactical nuclear release became irresistible. Every improvement in tank performance was, in this sense, a delay in the nuclear escalation clock. The Wilson government, which took office in October 1964, wrestled with this equation constantly. Dennis Healey's Defence Review of 1965 to 1968 slashed east of Suez commitments, but preserved BAOR and preserved Polaris. The two decisions were linked. Polaris, ordered from Vickers at Barrow and Camel Laird at Birkenhead, would provide the strategic deterrent from 1968 onward, when HMS Resolution began patrols from Faslane. BAOR would provide the conventional trigger. Between them, Healey argued to the Cabinet on July 22, 1966, they gave Britain a credible ladder, a phrase that entered the Whitehall vocabulary and never quite left it. What the ladder required at its lowest rung was that the tanks worked. By the mid-1970s, the Chieftain's engine problems were forcing decisions that Whitehall did not want to take. The L-60, despite continuous modification through Marks 8A, 9A and 10A, remained unreliable. The Master General of the Ordnance, Lieutenant General Sir John Gibbon, commissioned an internal review in 1973, which found that mean time between failures on the power pack was 175 miles. The figure was catastrophic. NATO planning assumed a Chieftain regiment could deploy across 400 miles of German countryside without significant mechanical loss. The reality was that half the fleet would break down before reaching its battle positions. The response, coordinated through the Fighting Vehicles Research and Development Establishment at Chertsey under Dr. Gilbert Harvey, was twofold. First, an emergency program to replace the L-60 with a Rolls-Royce CV-12 diesel, a program that eventually produced the Challenger tank rather than a re-engined Chieftain. Second, a fundamental rethink of armour. British designers at Chobham, working under the direction of Dr. Gilbert Harvey and later Dr. John Groves, had been experimenting since the late 1960s with a composite armour arrangement combining ceramics, steel and elastomeric layers. The material, known simply as Chobham armour after its place of origin, offered protection against shaped charge weapons that no monolithic steel plate could match. Chobham was Britain's most closely guarded conventional weapons secret. Developed at the Military Vehicles and Engineering Establishment, its precise composition was classified Top Secret Atomal, a category normally reserved for nuclear information. The Americans learned of it in 1973 through liaison exchanges under the ABCA agreements. The US Army sent a delegation under Major General Robert Baer to Chertsey in October 1973, and, according to declassified US records, returned to the Pentagon, convinced that Chobham was a generational advance in armoured protection. The M1 Abrams, then in early development at Chrysler, was redesigned to incorporate a variant of the British armour. In return, Britain received data on the American 105mm gun round development, and later on the XM1 fire control computer. The exchange was mutually valuable but not equal. Britain had given away the harder secret. Whitehall officials, particularly in the Defence Sales Organisation under Ronald Ellis, worried that the transfer had been badly negotiated. A minute from the Deputy Chief of the Defence Staff, dated February 14, 1974, complained that "we have obtained less than we have given and recommended tighter controls on future technology transfers." The complaint reached the Defence Secretary Roy Mason but produced no immediate change. The Chobham decision had been taken at cabinet level in the autumn of 1973 as part of a broader realignment of Anglo-American defence cooperation following the Yom Kippur War. The Yom Kippur War, in October 1973, had been an armoured revelation. Israeli Centurions, equipped with the L7 gun and British-supplied APDS ammunition, had destroyed Syrian T-62s at exchange ratios exceeding 10-1 on the Golan Heights. But the same war had exposed the vulnerability of tanks to Saga anti-tank missiles and, in the Sinai, to Egyptian infantry equipped with RPG-7s. The lesson absorbed at Bovington and Chertsey through detailed after-action analysis conducted by Brigadier Richard Vickers was that the tank had entered a new phase. Passive armour alone was no longer sufficient. Active protection, reactive armour, and integrated combined arms doctrine would define the next generation. The Challenger 1, ordered in 1978 and entering service in 1983, embodied these lessons. It carried Chobham armour, the CV-12 engine, and an improved L-11A 5-gun. Its development had been forced by the collapse of the Anglo-German-Italian tank programme, which had founded on national requirements that could not be reconciled. Britain went alone, and Vickers Defence at Newcastle built a tank that, in gunnery competitions at Bergen-Hohne against American M60s and West German Leopard 1s, consistently placed first. The Rhine Army, entering the last decade of the Cold War, had recovered its qualitative edge. The Falklands, in the spring of 1982, was not an armoured war, but it was fought under the shadow of the same industrial base that produced British tanks. The Royal Ordnance Factories, the Royal Armament Research and Development Establishment, the design bureaus at Chobham and Chertsey, all had been sized for a European war against the Warsaw Pact. When Argentina invaded on April 2, 1982, the Thatcher government drew on that base to project force to the South Atlantic in ways that surprised almost every foreign observer. The task force sailed from Portsmouth and Devonport within 72 hours of the cabinet decision. The Ministry of Defence under John Nott coordinated a mobilisation that drew on the entire British defence industrial base. Aircraft, ammunition, spare parts, medical supplies, the logistics chain that had been designed to sustain BAOR was redirected south. The Royal Marines Scorpion and Scimitar light tanks from B Squadron Blues and Royals under Captain Roger Field would be the only armour deployed. They landed at San Carlos on May 21st and fought at Wireless Ridge and Mount Tumbledown, their 76mm and 30mm guns supporting the final assaults on Stanley. What the Falklands demonstrated was less about tanks than about system. The British defence establishment, criticised through the 1970s as sclerotic and expensive, mobilised with a speed that Whitehall itself had not expected. GCHQ, working with American assistance, provided signals intelligence that gave the task force commander, Admiral Sir John Fieldhouse at Northwood, near continuous knowledge of Argentine dispositions. The Chief of the Defence Staff, Admiral Sir Terence Lewin, coordinated a joint operation across 3 services in ways that had been theorised at Shrivenham but rarely practised. The Argentine surrender on June 14, 1982, changed British defence politics. Thatcher, who had come to office in May 1979 committed to reducing defence spending, now argued in Cabinet that the equipment programmes must be protected. The The Trident decision, taken in July 1980 to replace Polaris with an American-supplied ballistic missile system, was reinforced. The Challenger program was accelerated. The Royal Navy's surface fleet, which John Nott's 1981 Defence Review had planned to cut savagely, received a partial reprieve. The politics of victory shifted the arithmetic of defence spending in ways that lasted for the rest of the decade. For BAOR, the mid-1980s were paradoxical. The equipment was better than it had ever been. Challenger tanks were entering service. Warrior mechanized infantry vehicles were on order from GKN Sankey. The new SA-80 rifle, though troubled, was being issued. Chieftains remained in service and had been upgraded with steel brew composite armour, developed at Chertsey by Colonel John Brewer and named for him. Signals intelligence from GCHQ suggested that Soviet forces in East Germany, though still numerically superior, were suffering from equipment obsolescence and training deficiencies. The JIC assessment of 1985, drafted under Sir Percy Craddock, described the Warsaw Pact's conventional advantage as diminishing but real. The final chieftain trials were conducted in 1985 at Suffield in Alberta, the British Army Training Unit's Canadian Ranges, against simulated Soviet opposition. The exercise, codenamed Medicine Man, involved live firing at ranges up to 3,000 metres. The results filed at MOD in a report classified Secret UK Eyes Only showed hit probabilities of 87% at 2,000 metres and 63% at 3,000 metres, figures that comfortably exceeded the requirements for engaging Soviet armour in the North German plain. The Chieftain, at the end of its service life, was still doing what it had been designed to do: outrange, outshoot and outlast anything Kubinka had built. The end came faster than any JIC paper had predicted. The Berlin Wall opened on November 9th, 1989. Chieftains of the 4th Armoured Brigade were on exercise at Soltau when the news reached them. Regimental history records that officers stood in the mess and listened to the BBC World Service in disbelief. Within a year, the two Germanys were united. Within 2 years, the Soviet Union was gone. The Warsaw Pact, whose forces had shaped every British defence decision since 1948, dissolved formally at a Prague meeting on July 1st, 1991. The options for change review, announced by Tom King as Defence Secretary on July 25, 1990, cut BAOR from 55,000 to 23,000 personnel and reduced the tank fleet accordingly. Regiments that had held sectors in Lower Saxony for 40 years were amalgamated or disbanded. The 17th/21st Lancers merged with the 16th/5th Lancers to form the Queen's Royal Lancers. The Royal Hussars, whose Centurions had fought at the Imjin and whose chieftains had held the Weser line, joined the 14th/20th King's Hussars. The industrial base contracted with them. Royal Ordnance had already been privatised in 1987, sold to British Aerospace for £190 million. At Kubinka, meanwhile, the archives began to open. Russian defence historians, working with the German journalist Rolf Hilmes and the American armour specialist Stephen Zaloga, gained access to the 1952 trials report. What emerged was the full extent of the Soviet assessment. Not merely respectful, but, in places, alarmed. The report had concluded that the Centurion represented a level of engineering integration which our industry cannot yet match. The recommendations had shaped the T-55 and, indirectly, every subsequent Soviet tank. Kubinka had told Moscow in 1952 what Whitehall had never quite dared to believe: that British armour was the best in the world. The Chieftain, in its final Mark 11 configuration, was withdrawn from BAOR service in 1995. Some vehicles were sold to Iran under contracts signed before the 1979 revolution and never fully honoured. Others went to Jordan, where they served for another decade. Challenger 1 replaced them in the front line and was itself replaced by Challenger 2, which entered service in 1998. The industrial thread that ran from Barnbow through Leyland to Newcastle upon Tyne unbroken since 1945, continued. Sir Percy Craddock, chairing the JIC through the closing years of the Cold War, wrote in his memoir that British intelligence had never predicted the collapse of the Soviet system. Neither had British defence planning. Both had assumed that the Warsaw Pact would remain a coherent military threat into the 21st century, and had built weapon systems, doctrine, and industrial capacity around that assumption. When the threat disappeared, the machinery it had produced was left standing. The Chobham armour, the L-11 gun, the Challenger production line at Newcastle, the composite plates at Chertsey. Testimony to a 40-year effort to solve a problem that had in the end solved itself. What Kubinka had told Soviet command in 1952, and what British planning had been trying to prove ever since, was a specific and narrow proposition. That industrial democracies, if they concentrated their engineering resources, could produce weapons of a quality that command economies could not match. The Centurion had proved it first. The Chieftain and the Challenger had proved it repeatedly. The Cold War had been, from one angle, a long argument about industrial systems conducted with steel and tungsten and the electronics of fire control computers. Britain had won that argument on the ground where it mattered most, the North German plain, without ever having to fight the battle for which its armour had been designed. The tanks had done their work by being too formidable to be tested. That, in the end, was Bovington's quiet victory, and Kubinka had understood it first.